Let's explore dynamic compound verbs in the Lingdoc's Pashto dictionary. Now, you'll see compound verbs a lot in Pashto. And there's actually two kinds. There's dynamic compound verbs and stative compound verbs. And these behave very differently. And if we understand that these are two different types, then it hopefully will clear up a lot of confusion about how compound verbs work and why they do different things in different sentences. So today let's look at dynamic compound verbs. So you'll run into these if you look for a word like to ask. Here's a verb, it's a dynamic compound, and it's transitive. So what is a dynamic compound? Let's look inside. So a dynamic compound is, in this case, it's a combination of an auxiliary verb here, kawal, and puchtana. So dynamic compounds, you'll notice down here it says object. So a dynamic compound is a verb that talks about doing or performing some sort of action, hence why it's called dynamic. And it always brings its own object. You see this? So here we have kawil, and we have a to do what? To do a question. So basically, when we say to ask in Pashto, we're saying here to do a question. Now notice this is kawil to do, not kawil to make. If we look at the roots and stems here for this auxiliary verb, we notice that on this side it takes a wu over there. But if we look at, kawil to make, then the roots and stems are different. It doesn't have that wu prefix there. So we'll see more about the difference between that in the next video. But let's look back at pochtana kawil. So this is using the auxiliary verb to do, and then it's bringing along the object here. So if we start making phrases out of it, look, we can choose our subject, but the object is already chosen for us. It's included in the dynamic compound, puchtana. So we're always going to be doing a question. And this dynamic verb just comes to the sentence and brings along its own object. So we can say, I is the subject. I'm asking a question. I ask, or I'm asking. So basically you're saying I am doing a question. So if we look at the blocks here, we can see that we have our subject, we have an NP for the subject, we have an NP for the object, and that NP is brought in. It's the object that comes along with this dynamic verb, and there's our auxiliary verb, kawal. So zapuchtina kawam. If we change the tense, if we say, let's say if it's a perfective future, zabapuchtina ukam or ukram, and then we're just using the perfective future of that auxiliary verb, and then we're using the object as puchtina. Now you notice, because this object here that comes as the verb is just like a regular object in the sentence, so we can even change the order. You can put the object in front of the subject if you want. Puchtina bazawukam. So that's, you can change the order to emphasize things. And the cool thing about these dynamic compounds in the past is that because this is a transitive verb, if we use it in the past, the object is going to be the king of the sentence. So the object is always the king of the sentence. The object is always going to be the this NP, this noun phrase that comes along with the verb. So ma puchtina ukra. Let's look back at the text. Ma puchtina ukra. So it doesn't matter who's asking the question, it's always going to be puchtina ukra. So in the past tense, it's just really simple because it always agrees with the object that comes along with the verb. But there's also other verbs. Let's look at if you might run into another verb called manda wahal, to run. So this is interesting because now we're using wahal as the auxiliary or helper verb, and our object is manda, which is like a run. You can see that's the object there. And yeah, so now the object is going to be this manda. So we can say za manda waham, but you can also make it plural if you want. You can make the object plural, say za mandi waham. So you can see people, you'll hear people say either za manda waham or mandi waham. And then again in the past tense, it's going to agree with the object included in the verb. So ma mandi uwahale, you can see here the object is the king here. And so it's ma mandi uwahale if it's plural, or manda uwahala if it's singular, because this is feminine singular, this is feminine plural, and the verb is in the past tense will always agree with the object, which is the king. And in the present tense, it'll agree with the subject. If you're confused about that, you can go back to the video on verb phrase structure, because Pashto does that strange ergative stuff with the present and past tenses. So another thing to note about these dynamic compounds, and again, so with just to review that it's the dynamic compounds just bring their own object into the sentence, and then in the sentence, this just behaves as a regular object block. But it's brought in with the verb, and you have to use that object of the verb, which kind of brings us to an interesting situation when you say something like "Pochtana kawal." So in English we would say "I ask you," right? I'm asking you, but we can't bring another object in Pashto. So you have to say something like "Z latana pochtana kawam." I'm asking from you. So whenever you add another thing in the sentence, it has to be brought in by sandwiches or other things like that. You can't add a second object in. That's the only object that you can have in the sentence. And another thing to watch out for is that some of these verbs can be either stative, which we'll see in the next video, or dynamic. So a verb like shuru kawal, to start, this could be either stative or dynamic, and so the whole way it behaves will totally change, because stative compounds are a totally different thing. They're a little bit more complicated, and we'll get into that in the next video.